Once upon a time, in a small town nestled between the rolling hills, there was a 16-year-old girl named Nancy. She had dark brown hair, big, curious eyes, and a heart full of dreams. But there was something about Nancy that made her different from other kids her age. While most teens seemed fearless, outgoing, and comfortable in their skin, Nancy was shy and introverted. She had a deep desire to learn English and speak fluently, but the thought of it filled her with fear. Fear of being laughed at. Fear of sounding silly. Fear of making mistakes. Nancy's friends at school often talked about how cool it was to be able to speak English. They said things like, "Imagine traveling to the US or meeting people from different countries. English is the language of the world." Nancy wanted that. She wanted to be able to speak with anyone, anywhere. She imagined herself talking to people from different cultures, learning new things, and experiencing life in a way she could only dream of. But each time she thought about speaking English, her palms grew sweaty, her throat tightened, and she'd quickly push the idea away. What if someone laughed at her? What if they thought she sounded silly? The one person who noticed Nancy's struggles was her uncle, Thomas. Uncle Thomas wasn't your average uncle. He was a man of adventure and wisdom. He had traveled the world, learning different languages and meeting people from all walks of life. His home, a cozy cabin at the edge of the town, was filled with souvenirs from different countries. Books in foreign languages lined the walls, and his stories about his travels were nothing short of magical. One Sunday afternoon, Nancy sat in her favorite spot by the window, staring out at the world, wishing she could speak English. Her uncle, noticing her distant gaze, walked over to her. He was tall, with a broad smile and an easygoing charm. Uncle Thomas had a way of making anyone feel comfortable. He sat down beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Why the long face, kiddo?" he asked with a warm smile. Nancy looked at him and sighed. "I want to learn English, Uncle Thomas. I want to speak it so badly, but I'm just so scared." Her uncle nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. He had known Nancy's dream for a long time, but what he didn't know was just how much fear held her back. "Tell me, Nancy," he said softly, "what are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid of making mistakes," Nancy replied. "What if I say something wrong? What if people laugh at me?" Uncle Thomas chuckled, a sound full of warmth. "Ah, the fear of making mistakes. That's something I know very well." Nancy raised an eyebrow, curious. "You, Uncle Thomas?" "Oh, yes," he replied with a wink. "I've made many mistakes in my life, especially when I was learning new languages. But do you know something important?" Nancy shook her head, eager to listen. "Mistakes are your best teachers. You see, the only way to truly learn anything, including English, is to embrace the mistakes. Without them, you wouldn't grow." Nancy stared at her uncle, unsure of what to think. "But what if they laugh at me?" Her uncle smiled gently. "Who cares if they do? The people who laugh at you are the ones who are too afraid to make mistakes themselves. You'll never know what you're capable of unless you try. If you stumble, pick yourself up and try again. Every time you do, you'll be one step closer to your goal." Nancy's heart began to race, with a mix of hope and doubt. It sounded good, but could she really do it? Could she face her fear and speak English, even if it wasn't perfect? Uncle Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. "Let me tell you a secret," he said, leaning closer. "You don't need to be perfect to speak English. What you need is courage. Courage to speak, to make mistakes, and to keep going." Nancy thought about his words. Her uncle had traveled the world, speaking different languages with people from all over. He hadn't been perfect, but he had connected with people, learned, and grown. Maybe she could do the same. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll try." Uncle Thomas smiled proudly. "That's my girl. Let's start small. Tomorrow we'll do a little exercise together. I'll teach you a few phrases in English, and we'll practice them every day." The next day, Nancy found herself sitting across from Uncle Thomas, who had a notebook open in front of him. He wrote down a few simple sentences. "Hello, how are you? What's your name? And I'm learning English." Nancy read the sentences aloud, her voice a little shaky at first, But Uncle Thomas didn't let her get discouraged. "Perfect," he said with a grin. "Now, let's practice it. Say it again, but this time, pretend you're talking to a friend. Imagine you're asking them how their day is going." Nancy took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and then said, "Hello, how are you?" She felt silly at first, but when she opened her eyes and saw her uncle smile, she felt a sense of accomplishment.
"See," he said.
"You did it. No one's laughing at you. You're just practicing. The more you practice, the easier it gets." Each day, they continued their practice. At first, Nancy struggled. She stumbled over words, her accent felt awkward, and she was afraid that others would hear her mistakes. But Uncle Thomas was patient, always encouraging her to try again, to laugh at her mistakes, and to keep speaking. Slowly, Nancy began to notice something incredible happening. The more she practiced, the more comfortable she became. One evening, after a week of daily practice, Nancy sat at the dinner table with her family. Her father, who spoke only a little English, was trying to learn a few words. Nancy, feeling nervous but determined, decided to help. "Dad, let me teach you," she said, her voice slightly shaky, but filled with a sense of pride. "Say, how are you?" Her father looked at her, his face lighting up. "How are you?" he repeated. "Great." "Now say, 'I'm fine, thank you,'" Nancy said, her confidence growing. "I'm fine, thank you," he said with a smile. Nancy felt a surge of joy. She had done it. She had spoken English and helped someone else learn. It wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had tried. And she was getting better every day. As the weeks went by, Nancy's confidence grew. She started listening to English music, watching movies with subtitles, and even reading short stories in English. She realized that the fear she had once felt was slowly fading. Every day, she was learning something new. One day, Nancy and her uncle went for a walk in the park. The trees were turning golden, and the air had a crisp chill to it. As they walked, Nancy spoke with her uncle about her progress. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I'm actually speaking English. I still make mistakes, but it's getting easier." Uncle Thomas smiled proudly. "I told you. The key is not to fear mistakes. It's about the journey, the progress you make, and the courage to keep going. You've done an amazing job, Nancy." Nancy smiled, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had done it. She had faced her fear and learned something new. And it was only the beginning. Nancy's first steps. The journey continues. A few weeks had passed since Nancy made her decision to conquer her fears and learn English. It wasn't easy, but she kept going. Every day, Uncle Thomas would remind her, "Mistakes are just stepping stones." That phrase stuck with Nancy like glue. She found herself repeating it in her mind whenever doubt started to creep in. One evening, while they were having dinner at her uncle's house, Nancy noticed a change in herself. She was talking about her day at school, in English, without even thinking about it. She noticed how her uncle listened carefully, nodding with approval. "You're doing really well," Uncle Thomas said after she finished. "You've made more progress than you realize, Nancy." Nancy's face lit up. She had been practicing English in secret, writing in her journal, watching videos, and even speaking a little to her classmates. But this was the first time she realized how far she had come. Her sentences weren't perfect, and sometimes she still felt nervous, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she was speaking. The next day, Nancy decided to challenge herself. She had been following her uncle's advice to watch English videos with subtitles, but today, she decided to try something new. She would watch an entire movie in English, no subtitles. It felt like a huge leap, but she was determined. She sat in front of the TV, her heart racing. The movie she chose was The Secret Garden, a story her uncle had recommended because it was simple and full of heart. At first, it was difficult. The words blurred together, and the actors' accents were hard to follow. She wanted to give up. But then she remembered what Uncle Thomas had said. "Every time you try, you get closer to your goal." Nancy took a deep breath and pressed play. The first few minutes were overwhelming. She could barely catch any of the words. But then, As the scenes unfolded, Nancy realized she could understand bits and pieces. The gestures of the actors, their facial expressions, the tone of their voices, all these clues helped her piece together the meaning of what was happening. By the end of the movie, Nancy was amazed. She hadn't understood everything, but she had understood more than she thought she would. She smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. That night, she rushed to call Uncle Thomas. "Uncle, I did it. I watched the whole movie in English." Nancy's voice trembled with excitement.
"See?
"I knew you could," Uncle Thomas said, his voice warm with pride. "The more you immerse yourself, the more it becomes part of you. You're learning to think in English, and that's the secret." The days that followed were filled with small victories for Nancy. She found herself reading more in English, even when it wasn't for school. She borrowed books from the library, starting with children's stories that were easy to understand, but gradually moving on to more complex novels. Each page she turned felt like another small step in her journey. One afternoon, as Nancy was walking home from school, she bumped into one of her classmates, Emily. Emily was a bubbly girl who had always been kind to Nancy, but they didn't speak much outside of school. Emily greeted her with a smile. "Hey, Nancy. How's it going? I've noticed you've been speaking more English lately. You sound really good." Nancy's face flushed. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially in English. Her first instinct was to look down at the ground, shy as ever. But then, something in her clicked. She remembered her uncle's words, "Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Be proud of every step you take." With a deep breath, Nancy looked up at Emily and smiled. "Thanks, Emily. I've been practicing a lot. It's still hard sometimes, but I'm getting there." Emily's eyes widened. "That's awesome. I'd love to help you practice more. I'm not perfect, but I can speak a bit of English too. Maybe we can have some conversations." Nancy's heart soared. This was exactly what she had been dreaming of, talking to someone in English, without fear of judgment. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet up the next weekend to practice together. Nancy was nervous, but excited. For the first time, she felt ready to put her skills to the test. Nancy's first English conversation. The weekend arrived, and Nancy was waiting nervously at the local cafe. She had chosen a quiet spot by the window, where she could look out at the passing cars and calm her nerves. Her hands were shaking slightly as she clutched the notebook she had brought. She had written down a few sentences she wanted to practice, just in case the conversation didn't flow smoothly. Emily arrived, cheerful as ever. She waved excitedly and sat down across from Nancy. "Hey, Nancy. Are you ready to practice?" Emily asked, her tone upbeat. Nancy smiled, though she could feel the butterflies in her stomach. "I think so," she said, her voice a little softer than she intended. "I'm just nervous, you know." Emily nodded, her expression understanding. "It's okay. I feel the same way. But let's start small, okay?" Nancy took a deep breath and nodded. She opened her notebook, where she had written some simple phrases. "How was your weekend? What do you like to do? And what's your favorite movie?" Emily helped her with pronunciation, gently correcting her when needed, but always with kindness and encouragement. The first few minutes were a bit awkward. Nancy stumbled over a few words, and Emily had to help her with some phrases. But Nancy didn't mind. She was speaking, and that was all that mattered. As the conversation went on, Nancy found herself becoming more comfortable. The nervousness slowly faded away. She wasn't perfect, but she was improving, and that felt incredible. By the end of their hour together, Nancy was laughing and chatting with Emily in English, something she never thought possible just a few weeks ago. The turning point: confidence in English. After that day, something shifted inside Nancy. Her fear of speaking English began to feel less like a barrier and more like a challenge to overcome. She was no longer afraid of making mistakes. Instead, she looked forward to them, because each mistake was a lesson. One day, Uncle Thomas took her on a trip to a nearby city. As they walked around, exploring the shops and cafes, Nancy was amazed at how comfortable she felt in the English-speaking environment. When they ordered coffee, she practiced her English with the barista, asking for a cappuccino with a smile. When they sat down to enjoy their drinks, Uncle Thomas looked at Nancy with a proud smile. You've come a long way, Nancy. You've embraced the learning process. It's not just about speaking, it's about feeling confident in who you are. Nancy's heart swelled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Uncle Thomas. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You believed in yourself too, Uncle Thomas replied. You just needed a little push. Nancy's journey continues. Nancy's confidence in speaking English grew with each passing day. She was no longer afraid of making mistakes. She had learned that speaking a new language wasn't about perfection. It was about connecting with others, learning new things, and growing as a person. Her journey had only just begun, but Nancy knew that every small step she took was bringing her closer to the person she wanted to become. With Uncle Thomas's guidance, she had learned the most important lesson of all: don't be afraid to start. The path to success was built on courage, persistence, and the willingness to make mistakes. One day, Nancy looked in the mirror, smiled at herself, and said, I'm learning English, and I'm proud of it. She wasn't perfect, and that was okay, because in her heart, she knew she had already achieved something extraordinary. A new challenge, a bigger leap. By now, Nancy had come a long way. Her conversations in English with Emily were becoming more fluent. They met every weekend, always finding new topics to talk about. From school life to hobbies, to discussing the latest movies, Nancy was gradually gaining confidence. But one morning, Nancy's mother came into her room, holding her phone. Nancy, her mom said, looking a bit serious, there's a letter here for you from your school. It's about a speech competition they're holding next month. Nancy froze. A speech competition? Yes, they want you to choose a topic and speak about it in front of the whole school. You're invited to participate. Her mom smiled, clearly proud but also a bit concerned. Nancy's heart raced. She had done well with small English conversations, but speaking in front of an entire room? That felt like an impossible task. I can't do that, Mom, Nancy whispered, feeling her old fear creeping back into her chest. What if I make a mistake? What if they laugh at me? Her mother sat next to her on the bed, brushing a strand of hair from Nancy's face. You're much stronger than you realize, sweetie. You've already come so far with Uncle Thomas's help. This is just another step. Nancy sighed. She wasn't sure she could do it, but the idea of backing down felt worse than the fear of failing. That evening, she texted Emily, I think I've signed up for the speech competition. Emily's reply was almost immediate. What? That's amazing, Nancy. I'll help you practice. Nancy smiled a little. Emily had always been supportive, and the idea of practicing together gave her a glimmer of hope. Speech writing, a process of discovery. Over the next few days, Nancy worked on writing her speech. She had no idea what topic to choose. At first, she considered something easy, like talking about her hobbies, but then she remembered how much English had changed her life. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. English opens doors. It gives you the ability to express yourself, connect with others, and see the world differently. That was it. She would speak about her journey with English, about how it had helped her break out of her shell and find the confidence to be herself. It wasn't just a speech. It was a story she had lived. And that made her excited. Nancy spent days writing and revising. She kept the sentences simple, focusing on clarity rather than perfection. Her uncle helped her a lot during this process, reading through the speech and offering constructive feedback. You're doing great, Nancy, Uncle Thomas said one evening. But remember, your story is what will connect with the audience, not just the words. Feel it? Nancy nodded, trying to let the emotion of her experience come through as she read aloud. It was difficult at first, but with every word, her confidence grew. She realized that she wasn't just learning to speak English, she was learning to tell her story. The big day, facing the stage. The day of the competition arrived. Nancy woke up early, her stomach full of butterflies. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. I can do this, she whispered to herself, repeating the mantra her uncle had taught her. I can do this. Her mom gave her a reassuring hug before they left for school. You've worked so hard, Nancy. Just take a deep breath and be yourself. When Nancy entered the school hall, She felt a wave of nerves wash over her. The stage was big, and there were so many people. It was her first time standing before a crowd like this. The other students were sitting in their seats, chatting quietly, and the teachers were setting up at the front. Nancy's heart was racing. She felt a bead of sweat form on her forehead. What if she froze? What if she forgot everything? Then, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Emily, waving from the front row. Nancy smiled weakly and took her seat beside her. "You got this, Nancy," Emily whispered. "Remember, this is your story." Nancy nodded, feeling a little better. She thought of her journey, of the fear she had faced and the small victories she had celebrated. She could do this. The competition began, and one by one, students went up to the stage to give their speeches. Nancy's turn was approaching, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at the floor, focused on breathing deeply. When the teacher called her name, she stood up. It felt like her legs were shaking, but she walked to the stage, holding her paper tightly in her hand. She stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and suddenly, all the words from her speech flooded back to her. "Hello, my name is Nancy," she began, her voice trembling slightly but steady. "Today, I want to talk about something that's really important to me. I want to talk about how learning English changed my life." The audience was quiet, listening intently. At first, I was too shy. I was afraid of making mistakes. I didn't want people to laugh at me, so I didn't speak at all. But then, my uncle, Thomas, taught me something important. Mistakes are just stepping stones. I started small. I listened to songs. I practiced with my mom and my friends. Slowly, I began to speak, and then I realized that English wasn't just a language. It was a way to express myself, to connect with others, and to become more confident in who I am. Nancy paused, taking a breath, her heart pounding in her chest. But instead of running away from her nerves, she faced them. "Today, I stand here before you, not because I'm perfect, but because I've learned to speak. And every time I make a mistake, I know it's part of the journey. I know it's okay, and I can keep going." Nancy looked out at the audience. She saw her mom beaming with pride, and Emily giving her a thumbs up. The room was silent, and in that moment, Nancy knew she had done it. She had faced her fear and shared her story. The result, more than just winning. When Nancy finished, the room erupted in applause. Her heart swelled with emotion, not because she had won the competition, though she had, by the way, but because she had shared a part of herself with everyone. She had opened up in a way that felt freeing. After the competition, her teacher came up to her with a smile. "Nancy, that was incredible. You spoke from the heart. You should be proud of yourself." Later that evening, when Nancy called Uncle Thomas to tell him the news, she could barely contain her excitement. "I did it, Uncle. I spoke in front of everyone. And I didn't make a fool of myself." Nancy laughed, her voice full of joy. Uncle Thomas's voice was filled with pride. "I knew you could do it. Remember, it's never about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to try." Nancy smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. She had faced her fear of speaking English, and in doing so, she had transformed herself. Nancy's ongoing journey. From that day forward, Nancy's journey with English continued to grow. She spoke more confidently in class, began to help her classmates with their English, and even joined an English book club with Emily. She found that the more she used the language, the more comfortable it felt. Nancy was no longer the shy, afraid girl she had been at the beginning. She was someone who embraced challenges, who knew that every mistake was an opportunity to learn. As she sat in her room one evening, reviewing some English notes, Nancy smiled to herself. She thought of her journey, the fear she had overcome, the struggles she had faced, and the victories she had celebrated. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas," she whispered, "for showing me that I am capable." And with that, Nancy knew her story was far from over. She had learned to speak English, but more importantly, she had learned to believe in herself. And that was just the beginning of all the incredible things she would accomplish. Chapter 6: A New Opportunity. Nancy's success in the speech competition was a turning point. The sense of accomplishment she felt after facing her fear and speaking in front of her peers was more than just a confidence boost. It ignited a new passion in her. She wanted to continue learning and improving her English, and she didn't want to stop there. Weeks passed, and Nancy's English skills continued to grow. She would spend hours after school reading books in English, watching shows with subtitles, and practicing with Emily. But soon, something unexpected happened that would take her journey to a new level. One Friday afternoon, as Nancy walked home from school, she received a message from her English teacher, Mrs. Lawrence.
Hi, Nancy.
I have something exciting to tell you. We've decided to create an English mentoring program at school, and we think you would be a great fit as a mentor. Would you be interested in helping others learn English? Nancy's heart skipped a beat. Mentoring? Her? She had never thought of herself as someone who could teach others. She was still learning herself. But the idea intrigued her. She thought about it for a few minutes before replying, "Thank you for considering me, Mrs. Lawrence. I'd love to help. I think I could learn a lot from this experience." Mrs. Lawrence quickly responded, "Great. We'll have a meeting next week to discuss the details. I'm sure the students will really appreciate your help." Nancy felt both nervous and excited. This was a big step. She had always been the one asking for help, but now she would be in a position to give it. Chapter 7. The Role of a Mentor. The next week, Nancy attended the first mentoring meeting. She was nervous, unsure of what to expect. Mrs. Lawrence explained that the program was designed to pair older students with younger ones who needed help improving their English. It would be a relaxed, informal environment where students could practice speaking, listening, and reading English without feeling pressured. Nancy was paired with a 13-year-old girl named Sarah, who was quiet and shy, just like Nancy had been only a few months ago. At first, Nancy didn't know what to do. She was still learning herself. How could she teach someone else? But as she sat with Sarah, helping her with vocabulary and listening exercises, she realized something. She didn't need to be perfect. What mattered was showing Sarah that English was something she could enjoy and feel comfortable with. They started with simple conversations, just like Nancy had done when she first started. "How are you today, Sarah?" Nancy asked with a warm smile. "I'm good, I think," Sarah replied nervously, glancing at her notes. "That's great. What did you learn in school today?" Nancy continued, encouraging Sarah to speak in English. Sarah hesitated, but then began talking about her day. Nancy listened carefully, gently correcting her pronunciation and guiding her with some vocabulary. She realized that being a mentor wasn't about being flawless. It was about creating a safe space for learning. Over the next few weeks, Nancy and Sarah met regularly. As they worked together, Nancy's own skills began to improve. By teaching, she was reinforcing her own learning. She started to understand that teaching others was also a way to learn. And most importantly, she began to see how powerful language could be, not just as a tool for communication, but as a way to build connections with people. Sarah became more confident in her speaking, and Nancy was proud of the progress they made together. One day, after their mentoring session, Sarah looked up at Nancy and said, "Nancy, thank you. I'm not so scared to speak anymore. You make it feel easier." Nancy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You're doing great, Sarah. You've come so far." Chapter 8. The Power of Connection. As Nancy continued her mentoring sessions, she began to understand the deeper power of language. It wasn't just about learning words and grammar. It was about connecting with people from different backgrounds, sharing stories, and opening doors to new experiences. One weekend, Nancy's Uncle Thomas invited her to join him and some of his friends for a gathering at their house. Nancy wasn't sure if it was a good idea. She had grown comfortable speaking English in small circles. Emily, her family, and Sarah, but meeting new people, especially adults, made her nervous. What if they asked her complicated questions that she didn't know how to answer? But Uncle Thomas encouraged her. "You've come so far, Nancy. You're ready for this. Remember, don't stress about being perfect. Just enjoy the conversation. You never know what you might learn or who you might meet." So Nancy agreed to go. When they arrived at the gathering, she was introduced to several people from different countries. There was Amina, an artist from Morocco, Lucas, a chef from Brazil, and David, a software engineer from Canada. They all spoke English fluently, and Nancy felt out of place at first. But as the evening went on, she started to see that the conversations didn't have to be perfect. At one point, Amina asked Nancy, "So, what do you enjoy doing in your free time?" Nancy thought for a moment before answering, "I like to watch movies, and I've been learning a lot of English through them. I also love reading books and helping others learn English." Amina smiled warmly. "That's amazing. I've always loved languages, too." "You're doing great, Nancy." As the conversation continued, Nancy found herself more relaxed. She asked questions, shared her thoughts, and even laughed at some of her mistakes. She realized that the fear of making mistakes was what had held her back for so long. But now, after so much practice and support from her uncle and friends, she was able to enjoy these conversations for what they were, connections, not tests of her abilities. As the evening came to an end, Uncle Thomas patted Nancy on the back. "You did great tonight. See? Every conversation is a chance to grow." Nancy smiled, feeling more confident than ever. She had taken a leap and found herself part of a global conversation. English was no longer just a tool, it was a bridge connecting her to people from all over the world. Chapter 9. The Road Ahead. As Nancy's English skills continued to improve, so did her confidence. She was no longer the shy, insecure girl who hesitated to speak. She had learned to embrace her mistakes, to speak her mind, and to see English as an exciting part of her future. One day, she had an idea. "Uncle Thomas," she said, "I want to do something to help others who feel like I did before. I want to start an English club at school." Her uncle's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea, Nancy. What do you have in mind?" "I want to create a space where people can practice speaking English without feeling nervous or afraid. We could have group conversations, watch English movies, or even play games in English." "Go for it," Uncle Thomas encouraged. "You've got the passion and you've already inspired so many people." Nancy worked hard to make the club a reality. She spread the word around school, and soon, students of all levels showed up for the first meeting. They practiced speaking, helped each other with vocabulary, and shared their love for learning the language. The club was a huge success, and Nancy found that her journey with English had come full circle. She had gone from a shy girl afraid to speak to someone who is now helping others on their own journeys. She had built something that would help many students grow and develop the confidence to speak English in their own lives. Nancy's story wasn't just about learning a language. It was about growing as a person, facing her fears, and using her voice to connect with others. Through persistence, encouragement, and self-belief, she had become not just a student of English, but a mentor, a leader, and someone who was changing her world, one word at a time. Her journey was far from over, but Nancy knew one thing for certain. English had given her the freedom to express herself and the courage to face whatever came next. And she couldn't wait to see where her next adventure would take her. Chapter 10. The Ripple Effect. Nancy's English Club became a popular part of her school life. Every week, students from different grades would gather to practice their English, play language games, watch movies, and most importantly, talk to each other in English without fear of making mistakes. The environment she created was open, inclusive, and warm, exactly what she had longed for when she was too shy to speak. In the early days, Nancy felt nervous. It wasn't easy to manage a group, especially with students who were at different levels of language proficiency. But she had learned something important along the way. People weren't there to judge each other. They were there to help each other. That was the foundation she had built the club on, and it was working. One day, after the club meeting, Emily came up to Nancy with a big smile. "Nancy, I have to say, you've really done something incredible here. Everyone seems so much more confident in their speaking now. You've turned this into something that feels more like a community than just a class. I'm so proud of you." Nancy smiled, feeling a warm flush of pride. "Thanks, Emily. It's hard to believe it's really happening, but it's been so worth it." The group was thriving, and word of the club spread across the school. Nancy noticed that her fellow students were starting to speak more confidently, not just in the club meetings, but in class as well. They would stop by her locker and say things like, "Hey, Nancy, I practiced my English over the weekend. I'm feeling much better about it now," or "Thank you for pushing me to keep going. I made it through a whole conversation in English yesterday." Nancy realized that this was exactly what she had wanted when she first started, a space where people could grow, make mistakes, and support one another. The ripple effect of her work was spreading far beyond what she had imagined. Chapter 11. The International Experience. As the English club flourished, Nancy received an email one morning that would change everything. "Dear Nancy, we are pleased to inform you that your application for the International Student Language Exchange Program has been accepted. You've been selected to represent your school and country in a 3-week exchange program in London this summer. We look forward to seeing your growth and contribution during the program." Nancy's heart raced as she read the email over and over again. She had applied for this program months ago, not really expecting to be accepted. But now it was real. Nancy was going to spend 3 weeks in London, living with a host family, attending an international school, and practicing English with students from all over the world. Uncle Thomas was thrilled when Nancy told him the news. "This is incredible, Nancy. I'm so proud of you. Just think about how much you're going to learn, and not just about English, but about the world." Nancy was excited, but also nervous. What if she made mistakes? What if she couldn't keep up with the other students, many of whom might speak English fluently? "You're going to do great," Uncle Thomas reassured her. "Remember, every mistake is a step forward. Just enjoy the experience." The weeks leading up to the program were filled with anticipation. Nancy started reading more about London, practicing with Emily, and brushing up on the vocabulary she might need. She even spoke to some of the students in her club, asking if they had any advice for traveling abroad and communicating with people in a different country. Finally, the day arrived. Nancy packed her bags and, with a mixture of excitement and nerves, boarded the plane to London. Chapter 12. A New World. Arriving in London felt like stepping into another world. Nancy's host family was warm and welcoming, and she quickly became friends with the other students in the program. But there were challenges too, speaking with people whose accents were different from what she was used to, trying to understand cultural references she wasn't familiar with, and feeling like an outsider in the beginning. But every time she faced a challenge, she remembered the lessons she had learned from her uncle, from Emily, and from her own journey. "It's okay to make mistakes," she told herself. "I'm here to learn." On her first day at the international school, Nancy was nervous. She had to introduce herself to the class, and her heart pounded as she stood up to speak. "Hello, my name is Nancy. I'm from the United States, and I'm learning English because I want to connect with people from all over the world. I'm really excited to be here." The teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Harris, smiled. "It's wonderful to have you here, Nancy. We're all here to learn together, so don't worry about making mistakes. Just speak from the heart." That moment of encouragement stuck with Nancy throughout her time in London. She started speaking more confidently, asking questions, and sharing her thoughts. She visited museums, tried new foods, and engaged in conversations with students from different countries. They would laugh together, teach each other new words, and practice speaking English in ways that felt natural. By the end of the 3 weeks, Nancy was speaking English as though it were second nature. Her accent had softened, her vocabulary had expanded, and her confidence had soared. But the biggest change wasn't in her language. It was in how she saw herself. She wasn't just someone who had learned English. She was someone who had used language to connect, to grow, and to share experiences with others. The program had not only improved her English, but it had opened her eyes to the richness of cultures and the power of communication. Chapter 13. Coming Full Circle. When Nancy returned home, she was different. She felt more confident in herself, more capable of navigating the world, and more connected to people from all walks of life. The experiences in London had shown her that language wasn't just a tool, it was a bridge to understanding, empathy, and new opportunities. Her English club continued to thrive, and she started sharing stories from her trip with the other students. She showed them pictures from London, explained the new expressions she had learned, and encouraged them to embrace English as a gateway to new adventures. just as she had. At the next club meeting, Nancy stood up and addressed the group. I want to thank all of you for making this club what it is. You've all inspired me so much. I was afraid to speak English at first, just like some of you. But now, I see how much we've all grown together. English isn't just about speaking well. It's about connecting with others, sharing our stories, and learning from each other. The students applauded, and Nancy felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had started as a shy girl who was afraid of making mistakes, and now she was helping others learn, grow, and embrace the power of language. Nancy's journey with English had come full circle. She had gone from being the timid girl who was afraid to speak to becoming a confident young woman who used language to connect with the world. But she knew that her journey wasn't over. There was always more to learn, more people to meet, and more adventures waiting for her. As she looked at her classmates, Emily and Uncle Thomas, she realized one thing. Learning English was never just about the language itself. It was about the people she met, the doors she opened, and the person she became along the way. This concludes Nancy's transformative journey of learning English, but her story is far from over. Through hard work, persistence, and the support of those around her, she has blossomed into someone who is not only fluent in English, but also deeply connected to the world around her. Her journey shows us that learning a language is more than just acquiring a skill. It's about overcoming fears, connecting with others, and opening doors to new opportunities.